It's no secret that there are elements in the gaming industry that seem to straddle the line between making a profit versus outright greed. And there's no clear definition of what's a reasonable desire to make a profit and an excessive one. No one can really fault anyone who's selling a product for wanting to make some money off of it. And video games, whatever else they might be, seen as either art or entertainment, are a product. And games are among the most profitable products in the world. And despite some people who think this is a new phenomenon, video games were even profitable when gaming was primarily relegated to arcade games, most prominently in the 1970s and early 1980s. For example, by the end of 1982, the combined revenue generated by both the arcade game market as well as the home game market amounted to an impressive $40 billion in today's dollars adjusted for inflation. That was a lot more than many other industries at the time, including some elements of the film industry and music industry. So gaming has always generated pretty good money, even in the early days. But one also needs to consider that these were games that were, on the whole, simpler and more straightforward than today's games, and correspondingly, expectations were probably much lower. Now, the CRPG, or RPG genre, is quite distinct from the vast majority of gaming genres on offer. One distinguishing feature is the fact that it tends to be somewhat less accessible than many types of games. You can only rarely just dive in and get your bearings within a short span of time. A contemporary example of this is the Pathfinder games, developed by Owlcat Studios. They are immensely complex and require many hours of commitment to properly understand and enjoy. Very few people can just jump into Wrath of the Righteous, for example. Contrast this with a game such as Pac-Man or Super Mario Bros., straightforward to the point, and don't require that level of time commitment. It's almost night and day. Of course, CRPGs are not the only genre of game that requires this level of commitment. There are others, such as Crusader Kings, a real-time strategy game, that are equally demanding. But by and large, most games are meant to be accessible. The fact that CRPGs typically require this time commitment tells you something about the type of people who play them. But more importantly, it also tells you something about the type of people who make them. A classic example of this is the now ancient Ultima series, which had a total of 9 games, and one of Sven Finke's favorite games is Ultima 7, and for good reason. The game serves as an inspiration for pretty much every game Sven has ever wanted to make. Now, for those of you who don't know, Ultima is a very old RPG that first came out in 1981 and experienced, as I had previously stated, a full 9 games set in the universe. Obviously, these were quite popular. Most of these would feel quite dated to the majority of people these days, but the Ultima universe and series introduced some groundbreaking concepts to the CRPG world that would later serve as that inspiration that Sven has mentioned so many times. These concepts are fairly non-linear gameplay, exploration, a fairly involved story, and to a lesser extent puzzle solving. But beyond this, the makers of the Ultima series, called Origin Systems, were all people who were passionate about what they were doing. Of course, they wanted to at least break even on their work, and even make a profit. But they also had a vision, something that tends to really stand out these days, and is a prominent feature that's obviously apparent in Larian Studios, who makes games first, and uses money as fuel for the games. But back in the day, this mentality and attitude was not all that rare, so the question arises as to what happened. What accounts for the overwhelming shift into and focus on a world of shareholders, quarterly profits, and mass fumigation and gutting of development studios? Well, it all goes back to the fact that making games can be expensive. And over the years, making games, above all large-scale AAA games, has gotten more and more expensive, incredibly so, in fact. AAA games, in contrast to indie titles, definitely require a lot more money in order to be made. And that money needs to come from somewhere. Developers have talent, skill, and ideas, and they want to see these ideas crystallized in the form of the games they want to make. But most developers lack the money to make the games they want to create, and thus they have to find ways of raising that money. For smaller scale and indie projects, this often takes the form of crowdfunding, which can be very effective. Some of my favorite games were funded and supported this way. Games such as Pillars of Eternity were funded this way, and even Divinity Original Sin 2 had partial crowdfunding. But public crowdfunding generally has limited scope, and the bigger the game you want to make, the less feasible that option is. High-quality, multi-feature AAA games cost in excess of $100 million to make, and very often even more than that. And usually, the only route for developers to go down to get that kind of money is to either find a publisher or become a vassal of a publisher. There are countless examples of this, but some of the more infamous examples are BioWare and EA, and we all know what happened there, and later, Obsidian and Microsoft. At the time of Microsoft's purchase of Obsidian, Fergus Urquhart, the company's CEO, explicitly stated that part of the reason for allowing Microsoft to take over was the constant worry about securing money for game development projects, and in particular, paying employees' salaries, and that problem is now solved. But as we all know, having a rich publisher is not a free lunch, and it comes with other costs. There are new expectations put on studios, and they almost exclusively revolve around profit. Now, as I stated, there's nothing inherently wrong with wanting to make a profit with the things you make, but the motivations of game developers, who tend to be more artistic than entrepreneurial, and those of publishers and their shareholders, are not always perfectly aligned. By this, I mean that large publishers have shareholders, who may or may not even have an interest in game development, and this isn't unique to the gaming industry. I've known dozens of people over the decades who invest based simply on profitability, with little knowledge or care for the product in question. Do you recall Sven Vinke's lamentation about quarterly profits?
I keep on seeing the same mistakes over and over and over, and it's always the quarterly profits.
Few shareholders have a long-term vision of what an IP can do or build up to, so they take the most cursory and expedient route to see if what they are supporting is profitable, given the limited context. You can't really blame them, I suppose. It's their nature. But artists, they are not, and their lack of patience can often lead to premature decision-making that damns entire studios and games, whether warranted or not, where the warranting, I suppose, depends on the eye of the beholder. This is understandable on some level. Making games is a weird thing. You pour years of work, sweat, and tears into a single game. It can cost in the hundreds of millions to make, and when all is said and done, it's released. And most of the time, you basically know within a month or so if the game was a flop. And perhaps worst of all, as none other than Lord Asmongold has stated many times, correctly I might add, players only care if the game is good or not. They don't care about the crunch time, the stress, the years invested, or even the money put into it. All that matters to them is whether the game is good and fun. And for better or worse, that's just the way it is. Considering these factors, it becomes more understandable why the people who fund games are so incredibly concerned about things like quarterly profits. You end up with a weird triangle of somewhat divergent interests that are all a little incongruent and a little at odds with each other. The shareholders and publishers only care how much money the game makes. The developers want acknowledgement not just for the game, but for their labor and effort, as well as artistic vision. And the players, well, players just want to have fun. I did say somewhat divergent, as all these divergent interests can at least theoretically be unified, and such things do happen. Baldur's Gate 3 is a perfect example of this. The publishers, Wizards of the Coast, were more than happy with the results. Larian, the development studio, felt appreciated for their work and effort, as well as their artistic vision. And finally, the players who had a blast playing the game. But it's also the case that it doesn't always happen that way. The list of games that have failed is fairly long. By fail, I mean they did not meet the expectation of the publishers or shareholders. But that doesn't have to mean that they were bad games. Many CRPG enthusiasts will be familiar with the game Tyranny, a truly amazing CRPG made by Obsidian, set in a Bronze Age Mesopotamian-like environment. Everyone who played it liked it, and it's one of my favorite games. And yet, it did not meet the sales expectations of the publisher, Paradox, and therefore will likely never see a sequel, which sucks because that game ended on a cliffhanger. And the same can be said for Pillars of Eternity 2, and so on and so on. Now, many people are wont to blame publishers exclusively for this problem, and it's absolutely true that they do play a big role in it. Consider BioWare, for example. Once the crown jewel of RPG makers, now failed and forgotten for all but their most devoted and blind acolytes. They were forced to adopt the Frostbite engine to make RPGs, even though it was not well suited to this genre of games, and they should have continued with the Unreal Engine. Why did they have to do this? Because Frostbite is made by DICE, which is a division of EA, who are trying to avoid licensing fees and to save money. This serves as but one example of many obstacles that a publisher can throw in the way of developers, but I guess those are the breaks. Another issue that comes up frequently is time and the pressure that arises from crunch, which in the case of BioWare used to be referred to as quote-unquote BioWare magic, purportedly pulling off miracles despite deadlines. Yes, having a publisher can be difficult. That said, sometimes it isn't just the publishers. Case in point, BioWare was given ample time to develop Anthem, and to be blunt, they borked it, and that failure had little to do with EA. Studios like Larian are few and far between. Most studios will not be able to operate with the same approach and mindset, for the simple reason that Larian is led by Sven Finke, who is calling all the shots. And Sven is, to put it plainly, unique. Notice how I did not mention the developers. Now, of course, I cannot know for sure, but I suspect that there are many studios out there with similar talent in terms of its developers, but without the proper guidance and leadership. And without that, it becomes difficult to optimize and produce the best product they can. In the context of Larian, you can imagine how things might go down there. Sven's development team has a set of ideas that they want to explore, and Sven, the anomaly that he is, actually listens and takes these ideas into consideration. And I would bet that Sven's passion for the development process is infectious. He is essentially the ultimate game developer. Unfortunately, most developers have to work for significantly less enthusiastic individuals who are focused on other things, money, and this is where greed, oddly enough, might be helpful. Excessive desire for monetization is most definitely a thing, and has crept into many genres of games, most prominently live service games, and even RPGs. But RPGs as a broad category are different, and can be different in this respect. The phenomenal commercial success of BG3 has instilled a novel idea in many who are exclusively concerned with profit. Yes, you can also make money off of single-player RPGs without nickel and diming players left and right. This has of course always been the case, but some people somewhere thought that because FIFA and online games do it, every game has to do it. But what is a little different this time, that is, in light of BG3's success, some higher-ups have been convinced that they might be approaching the single-player RPG genre incorrectly. This is manifested as Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast allegedly giving multiple studios more freedom and time to do what they need to. For example, in the case of the upcoming sci-fi game Exodus, Wizards had to sign an agreement that they would not interfere with the development process at all, and that all development decisions would be made by James Olin, the head of the studio. Now, this agreement was made before the release of BG3, but I don't think it's a coincidence that in the wake of BG3's success, there are multiple studios and projects that are being published by Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro. Many of these games are set someplace within the D&D universe, because whether people want to acknowledge it or not, D&D is still the most popular role-playing setting out there, even if some systems like Pathfinders are technically better. Supposedly, Hasbro has seen the light. Quote, Hasbro, the now longtime owner of Dungeons & Dragons maker Wizards of the Coast, is cooking up some big plans in the video game space, and the stunning success of Baldur's Gate 3 has proved to the company that the world wants more digital D&D adaptations. We're all super excited by the reaction to Baldur's Gate 3. Hasbro's head of game studios, Dan Ayub, tells Games Radar in an interview at the Game Developers Conference, I think it proved for us that people really want great D&D games. We're certainly doing that. Ayub believes that the success of Baldur's Gate 3 shows three things. First, that a high-quality D&D game, there's going to be an audience for that. Second, that a successful video game can bring more players into the tabletop world. Finally, there's the importance of taking time to get it right. That's a game that Larian was very diligent, very adamant about. We're going to have a long development cycle, and take the time we need to get it right. Now that Hasbro is building its own internal game development studios, Ayub says, we're taking a similar approach with the internal titles, adding that we've got to make sure the ones coming in now from our AAA studios hit home in a big way. End quote. Straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak, because the corpos see the potential dollar signs and realize that the best way to at least partially replicate what Larian has done is to allow the cookies in the oven to properly bake, with the hope that when they're done, they will be appropriately delicious and sell by the boatloads. And I'm not saying that this is a benign motivation on their part. Far from it. But we also have to realize, as stated previously, that Larian as a studio is very much a one in a million. And if that's the case, the best we can possibly hope for as consumers of games is that developers who are ultimately beholden to publishers and shareholders are given enough time to bake their cookies, and moreover that they're allowed to bake the cookies the way they want to. So it might be the case that just as greed has destroyed so much of the gaming industry, and perhaps more unfortunately the genre of RPGs, it just might be the only solution to saving parts of it, when it's inverted and turned on its head. Not for any noble cause, but rather for pragmatically driven reasons. Perhaps it is the case that even the greed of corpos might produce something nice in the end. I'm not sure, but the fact that Hasbro has at least signaled this suggests a new possibility going forward. Look, I'm not saying that rampant greed is good. Far from it. And I intensely dislike corpos and their ilk on a visceral level. but they exist and will continue to exist. And ultimately, as gamers, we have to hold out hope that most releases don't end up being an endless wave of schlock sandwiches. I admit, it's a weird silver lining, but maybe, just maybe, corpo greed, when redirected and rechanneled, tempered, and held in check just long enough, might pave the way for a better gaming future. Because you never know. Thanks for watching. If you like my content, you can leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe, as it really helps out the channel. It'd be much appreciated, and I will check you out next time. Take care.